This morning we continue our sermon series that we've been going on for the last few months now, as we've been looking at the heart of prayer and worship, as we've been looking at the life of David, and we've seen David in the Psalms and seeing his heart postures and his heart attitudes towards God and kind of seeing what that says to us. And we've gone through lots of different kind of topics over the last few weeks. I think some of them hopefully will come up on the screen that they'll jog your memory. We've had kind of a consecrated heart, a sacrificial heart, an enduring heart, all of these different kind of things. And this week our topic is a zealous heart, a zealous heart. So that is our topic this week. So we've got a few verses to start us off with in Psalm 69. Hopefully it's going to come up on the screen. I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. For zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me. For zeal for your house consumes me. If we can skip on to the next slide, Bethany. For zeal for your house consumes me. Zeal, or being zealous, isn't a word we use very much, is it? Especially outside of church. Has anyone heard it talked about much outside of a church setting before? It's not one that we use. And sometimes when we do use it, or when we have heard it, there's probably sometimes been some negativity around it, someone being overzealous. So what's the meaning behind it? The word here, the word that is used for zeal, it's a word that is describing a really intense feeling or emotion. A really intense feeling or emotion. The root word that is used there in the Bible is used in other ways throughout the Bible. It can be used to say something about jealousy, another intense emotion. It can even mean anger. But it also means passion, especially passion. When Jesus turns over the tables in the temple, which we'll journey towards in Lent as we get to that point where Jesus turns the tables over, John's gospel records that the disciples are reminded of that verse in Psalm 69. For zeal for your house consumes me. Dedication, desire, commitment, passion, all these kind of things, intense feelings and emotions that we may feel. Especially that one passion, it comes across so much. The NLT translation of that verse actually says, not zeal for your house consumes me, but passion for your house consumes me. J.C. Ryle, writing in Practical Religion, says, zeal in Christianity is a burning desire to please God, to do his will, and to advance his glory in the world in every possible way. It is a desire which is not natural to men or women. It is a desire which the Spirit puts in the heart of every believer when they are converted to Christ. We see this kind of zeal, this passion for God throughout David's life. Not just when we see that word, zeal or zealous, but we see it throughout the Psalms, this passion for God. We see it throughout his life. We see it in other places, this just burning desire for God. And we see it in intensely passionate moments of worship. One of those times is in 2 Samuel 6, 12 to 22, which is where we're going to be spending most of our time this morning in that verse. So if you can find that passage, if you've got a Bible with you, open it to those verses. Even if it's on your phone, that's all right. Get your phone out and get the verses up there. It's 2 Samuel 6, 12 to 22. The words are also going to be on the screen. And what we're going to do is I'm going to read it out to us, and then we're just going to spend a moment reflecting on it and see what jumps out to us. And we're going to do that by just turning to the person next to you. If you're okay with the person next to you and you trust the person next to you, then just have a little chat with them. So we're going to read it first, okay? So make sure you've got it. 2 Samuel 6, 12 to 22. Now King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone else from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes, but by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." So I'm going to give us a couple of minutes just to see what jumps out to us from that passage. Just talk to the person next to you. What does this say about a zealous heart and about passionate worship? Just a couple of minutes, as simple as that. Just what initially jumps out to you, or what have you really been struck by in that? Just a couple of moments just to chat to the person next to you. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together, but hopefully there's a lot of chattering going on, so I'm hoping lots of kind of thoughts and things coming out as we read that passage. But this is such, I think, a great passage to really sit and imagine the sounds and the noise and the visuals and the sights as we read about this triumphal entry coming in. We heard of trumpets and we heard of the sacrifices going on and the procession and the things going on. And you just really have to sit and imagine seeing that and seeing what is going on. And I think we see in this zealousness from David. I don't know if zealousness is a word, but I'm making it a word. Zealousness from David. This intense, passionate worship. David has been waiting for the triumphal entry as the king of Israel. He has been waiting years for this. It has been a long time coming. And when the time comes, they have issues about carrying the ark. They don't do it in the right way. And so they have this whole scenario, this awful kind of scene that happens, and they have to kind of go away, and then they realize how to do it the right way, which is by doing what God tells them to do, surprisingly. And they get it right, and eventually David understands, and so they begin to carry it in the way that God has asked them to do it. And the parade begins. It's wonderful, noisy, joyful celebration. Some people even think that Psalm 24 was written by David for this moment. Psalm 24 says this: "Lift up your heads, you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates. Lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is he? this King of glory, the Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory. And so there is a thinking that David made this psalm, composed this psalm to be shouted and sung at this very moment as they process in with the ark of God, as they go through to Jerusalem. David is fully aware he might be a king, but he is not the king. Who is he? The King of glory, the Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory. As people might have expected to see a king processing in on a throne, being carried by his people, the center of attention in this procession, coming along, David is making sure people are singing about the real king. And we have David in his linen ephod. Anyone got a linen ephod at home? Anyone know what a linen ephod is? Some take it to be that he's in his underwear, which is why Michal, David's wife, apparently despises him for being indecent. But it's probably not that it's in his underwear. It's kind of, the linen ephod was this kind of undergarment. But it's not the same as we would kind of expect an undergarment to be today. It's still covered quite a lot, don't worry. And don't worry, there's going to be no reenactments today from the priest. It was the undergarment of the priest, though. That was what it was. The linen ephod was the undergarment of the priest. And that is what Michal can't stand. David is the king, and kings are meant to be a certain way. It repeats in the passage a few times. We had it twice already just in those verses. You might have spotted it. Michal, the daughter of Saul. Not Michal, the wife of David. It's reminding us that Michal is a reminder of the old ways of doing things. What a king was supposed to do and to be. David represents not just the kingly, but a priestly role as well, foreshadowing the true priest king that will come in Jesus. And he doesn't come into his royal procession, into the royal city on the throne, but at the front of the line, as a priest, leading God's people into God's presence. That's not what a king was supposed to do, and that's what Michal doesn't understand and why she despises him. Giving worship every 6 steps along the way. If they're tempted to worship him, they sing the lines of Psalm 24. Who is he? The King of glory, the Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory. And we're told he dances, and he dances with all of his might. There is singing and rejoicing and celebration. He is prepared and willing to be undignified, to look undignified, to be mocked, because his only concern is to worship God, to put God at the center of everything and to keep God there. This passionate worship displaying a zealous heart for God. I think we see here that a zealous heart is one that is all in for God. That's what I see as I read this and I see David's attitude. He is all in for God. This passion for God that doesn't count the cost. It doesn't count the sacrifice. It is prepared to be thought of as foolish. It doesn't matter if they're praised or ridiculed, thought wise or foolish, whether they get honor or are shamed. It doesn't matter because they are all in for God. I wonder if we are challenged by that and what David's heart is for God. But at the same time, it's not this out of control, chaotic heart. That's where we can fall into danger of thinking of a word like zealous. Being zealous is positive, having passion towards something, but it can be misplaced. Paul says in Romans 10 that the religious people of his day are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. And so, because of their rejection of Jesus, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Our zeal can be misplaced. Paul himself was zealous in persecuting the church before he was saved. It even meant that he gave the approval for the murder of Stephen. And so we have to be aware that a zealous heart can be bad if what it is zealous for isn't right or is misplaced. A zealous heart for God is one that cares for one thing, to live for one thing, and that is to please God. Passionate worship of God. But we shouldn't limit what that might look like. Otherwise, we develop a too narrow view of what a zealous heart might look like. What do we see about passionate worship in this passage? It's loud. It's triumphal. It is noisy. There is a wildness to it. Being caught up in the wild things of the Spirit of God. What some think of as undignified, God receives as true worship of the heart. What some perceive as undignified, God receives as true worship of the heart. But it's not chaotic. It is wild, but not chaotic. It comes from a hearing and a responding to what the Spirit is doing, to what God is asking. Not forcing it or manufacturing it. Also being aware of others. We don't want our passion to trample on others, but to lift others and encourage others. David's passion and zealousness for God is to lead the line into God's presence and bring everyone with him. In this passage, we see a passion as being noisy, but it doesn't have to be. Passion comes in different ways. In our culture, it often is seen, isn't it, of passion as being loud, like maybe some Scottish fans at the rugby yesterday when the try goes over. Neil's cheering at the back there. It's all right, you can lynch him at the end. That's fine. Or we think of it in sports situations. We see it all the time, don't we? A goal going in the final minute and the wild delirium of the passion of the fans. That really shows passion. Being noisy and loud. My son has a passion for collecting football cards. And what this passion looks like is a weekly video call every week for an hour with his cousin, who also collects football cards. And they talk about which ones they've got and which ones they want to swap and which one's their favourite. And you can hear them in the other room just chatting, go on and on and on and on and on. It looks like him taking out his football cards from his wallet and taking them out and laying them all out on the floor and putting them in formations and having little matches against each other for hours on end. It looks like him talking to me and Susanna, and bless Susanna, because sometimes he says names and I don't know if she realizes whether they're players or teams or whatever it is. It just starts to glaze over a little bit. But you can see the light in his eyes as he talks about these things. Passion about these football cards for him looks like putting them back quietly with dedication and commitment in order before he goes to bed at night. Poring over them, talking about them, talking to us endlessly. You can see such a passion for them. It's not noisy. It's not a wild celebration. but you cannot doubt that there is a passion there. And I wonder in our own lives if we've seen passion in people or in ourselves, or things that we are passionate about, how does that display itself? On those days that, as we engage this year in prayer and fasting, those days may not be noisy. We may not feel very triumphant on those days. But that doesn't mean that it's not passionate. It's about discerning what's appropriate for the context. A coronation parade, a triumphal entry into the city. It's totally appropriate for David to be dancing, and dancing in all his might. It's appropriate for him to be wearing the clothes, even though they might seem out of place, but they don't when you understand what they represent. It's a celebration and there is rejoicing, but it wouldn't always be appropriate for that type of worship. But that doesn't mean that it's not passionate worship. Weeping and lamenting can be passionate worship. Quiet and contemplative can be passionate worship. It's about being authentic and about what our hearts are doing. It's also from a place of hope and a relationship with God, not a performance and drama. David's worship comes from a place of longing for God's presence, of passionately pursuing that. We see that constantly throughout the Psalms, not just in those triumphal moments, but when he's on his own, in times of difficulty, in quiet places. It's the same passion that is in the public spaces. Flowing from a place of intimacy, not from a place of performance. We can all become very passionate about things when there is a hype, when something is trendy. Some people get very passionate about royal weddings when they happen. A lot of us get very passionate for 2 weeks of the year in June when Wimbledon is on, and we become very passionate about tennis. But our hearts are not zealous for it. We just like the performance and the drama and the entertainment. We have to guard our hearts that we're not going down that road when it comes to worship. And it's not just about being passionate in worship in terms of singing, but it also includes all of our lives. It includes the serving parts as well. Are we as passionate about worshiping God when we are serving? When we make the drinks and put the chairs out? Is it with the same zealous heart for God? David sacrificed in worship every 6 steps to Jerusalem. There is a sacrificial nature to our worship, and to be passionate in that. Paul says in Romans that our whole lives are to be a living sacrifice, and that is our worship to God. Are we passionate in that? And so we have to be aware of all of those things when we think of passionate worship. Wild and undignified, but not chaotic. It can be noisy and loud, but that doesn't mean it has to always be that. The level of sound doesn't indicate holiness. It's the heart and the authenticity. It's a response to God and the overflow of our hearts, not a performance. Are our hearts the same in the quiet places? And it's not just feel-good singing when we feel like it, but also sacrificial and serving, covering all areas of life. And yet, even considering all of those things, even putting in some of those things to protect ourselves and to guard our hearts and to make sure they are zealous for the right thing. When we think about worship, when we think about the times when we gather together, when we read of a gathering of God's people triumphantly processing in to the city, as we see that connection with our own celebrations on a Sunday of a people gathering together to enter into God's presence. When we think of that worship, I reckon we are more likely to play it safe. It's not often that most of us will be told to just rein it in a little bit. Just calm down a little bit. You're getting a little bit too passionate in worship. Has anyone been mocked in worship for being too undignified? I wonder if there's going to be one hand. Thank you, Nick. It can be for a whole number of reasons. When we come together to worship, what are we thinking? What are we doing? Are we holding back in our worship? Has anyone had the thoughts that if they put their hands up that someone might be looking at them? Has anyone been wondering that someone might see their sweat patches if they raise their arms in worship? There's a reason I'm wearing black. You can't see them as well. What if I'm not doing it right? What if I don't have the right words? Just a reminder that people think about you a lot less than you think they do, if at all. To God, you are incredibly special and important. To other people, not so much. If we want to move into God's presence more, we have to be aware of what's holding us back, of what is pulling us away. And I don't say that in a way that is trying to force someone and say, this is the way that it should be. But I have a sneaky suspicion from my own experience that there are times where I have felt like I should respond in some way in worship, and I haven't. Because of my own thoughts that are holding me back. My thoughts about what someone else is going to think about me. Or whatever else it is. So it's not about forcing it or manufacturing it. But sometimes we do need to be pushed and moved. When I became a Christian, when I gave my life to Jesus, a few months later, there was, at our old church in the youth group, we used to lead a service of an evening once a term. And our youth minister, I'd known him for a long time, since I was a child, but I'd come back to this youth group and I'd given my life to Jesus. And we were talking about what was going to happen in this service, and he said, well, it's going to come to the preach, so we need someone to do that. Kieran, you'll do that. And I went, no, I absolutely will not. Guess who ended up doing the preach? Somehow I found myself doing it. If the youth minister had waited for me to offer to do it, we would still be waiting now. Sometimes we do need to be nudged. And again, I don't say that as someone up here who finds it easy to be at the front, and you might think, well, you're the preacher, that's easy enough for you to say. When I was in my second year of school, the teacher that I had, Mrs. Radcliffe, amazing teacher, her life mission for that year, for me, was to get me to talk. That was it. That was the big thing, was to get me to talk. So I don't stand up here as someone who would be up here naturally. There is only one reason that I am up here. And that is through the grace of God, who is the King of glory, the Lord Almighty. And again, I don't say that as something to look at me about, because believe me, there are still times in worship where I wonder, is someone going to look at me in a funny way? Am I doing the right thing in this moment? And so what we need is a level of vulnerability. And as we keep opening ourselves up to what God is doing, as we keep putting ourselves in positions of dependency on God, I believe that will take us deeper into more passionate worship. And so what do we bring on our times when we gather together on a Sunday? Are we expectant that we're going to come into God's presence and that God is going to do something? David is dancing with all his might. He is giving it everything because he knows that being in God's presence is the only thing that matters. And that changes everything. What mindset do we bring to our worship? It's not just about a Sunday. But when we do come together, most often on a Sunday, what mindset are we in? We spoke in a group at the Lectio course a few weeks ago, someone saying that it should be like we're coming to a party. That doesn't mean that we put a fake smile on our faces when things are going bad. What it means is that when you go to a party, you go with your gift, you go expecting, you go in a place of wanting to join in with this celebration. Are we coming expecting to meet God? Do we want to worship him with everything that we have? And that's not just all the good stuff, but all of our stuff, all of the things going on. Or are we consumers waiting to be entertained and topped up for a week? So I'm just going to invite the band to come up and lead us as we respond. I was in a church a number of years ago, and I'm not sure I'd even come to faith yet. I had, thank you, remember. I had come to faith. And it was a very loud and noisy church. And the pastor was on the stage and he was dancing and he was singing and he had the microphone and people were up and some people weren't and he said he's going to start coming around with the microphone. And until everyone was singing and dancing, we weren't going to go home. And I thought to myself, we're going to be here a very long time. We know when it can feel forced, when it can feel like it's a performance. That's not what a zealous heart is about. It's about a passion for coming into God's presence, of it being all about God, and everything else is just a sideshow. Everything else gets quietened and pushed to the back. And how we respond in that. Sometimes it may be quiet, sometimes it may be sitting, sometimes it may be with our hands up, sometimes it might be that we kneel down. I said it's not to feel forced, but if you've ever had a thought in worship that you feel like the Holy Spirit is doing something, and then your next thought has been, no, I couldn't possibly do that. Let's commit to one another that we're going to push ourselves, not for performance, but for the presence of God. So if you're willing and able, would you stand for the moment? And just as we begin to respond and go into worship, there's just two questions to ask ourselves that I'm just going to put on the screen. They may have already been up there at the very end. As we begin to respond, just asking ourselves, asking God, what is holding me back? Is there anything holding me back? from passionately pursuing your presence? And are there any things in my life I am more zealous for than you, Jesus? And would you reveal them to me? So Lord, we ask you to show us what's holding us back. What's holding us back from being all in for you and from passionately pursuing your presence. And would you reveal if there's anything in our lives that we're more zealous for than you, Jesus? And would you grow in us a zealous heart for you? Grow a life of passionate worship to you.